morning, everyone. Thanks for joining in. As you know, today we'll have the webinar on neurodiversity and STEAM. Thanks to the Dr. Alexander Palmer, who is joining us from the King's College London. And this is a webinar made and co-organized by the Cheese Equality Committee with the Max Center of Excellence and Easy Ways. So I don't want to take more time because we are here to listen to Alexander. So I'll give you the floor now.
Thanks for the introduction, both. Hi everyone, my name's Alex. My pronouns are he, him. I'm gonna share my screen. And before I go any further, I'm gonna ask people to give me a wave or react in chat or something and make sure that everyone can see it. Cool. Okay. I've not had anybody saying, no, it's completely black, so let's make a start. So, hello. A little bit about me, a little bit of context. My name's Alex. My pronouns are he, him. I've very recently finished my PhD in chemistry education. So I'm going to be doing the actual ceremony graduation bit at the end of July, which is very fun and exciting and definitely not scary. I've been doing work around equality, diversity, and inclusion in various capacities, in various roles, since about 2016. So I've been doing this for quite a while. And most relevant for this presentation, I'm autistic and ADHD. Both of these are formally diagnosed, and a lot of the work that I've done and the projects that I'm going to be talking about here is drawing very much on my lived experience in addition to academic and research literature. I do want to caveat this with saying lived experience can be really powerful, really important, but part of doing research of any kind is acknowledging one's own role in the process. So I want to be very clear that this is my perspective. It's grounded in research, and I will be talking about some of the national data in the UK, and I will be talking about research literature, but fundamentally it is still me sitting here talking to you. The other point to make very early on is to say that this is going to be very centered on the UK because that's where I live. It's where I've lived my whole life. It's where I've studied and done all of my research. I'm aware that some of the things I'm talking about will not necessarily be universal, particularly with regard to legal frameworks and things like that. But hopefully we'll be able to talk about good practice that can translate, things that can apply in your context, and identify key things to avoid. I'm going to be talking for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. This bit where I'm chatting away is being recorded. The Q&A at the end will not be. If you have any questions, I'm going to ask that you either write them down in chat, write them down on a bit of paper, or hold on to them until the end, because if we get into questions during the presentation, it will devolve entirely into a discussion and I won't get past the fifth slide. The other thing, one last thing before we get into it, if I start speaking too quickly and you can't understand me or you need me to slow down, please give me a wave in chat, put something in the chat, react, so that I know to pause and take a breath. Because there's a lot of people here, and I am not what you might call a natural presenter, as I suspect a lot of us aren't. But anyway, let's get into it. So, I'm going to start by defining the terms as I'm going to be using them throughout this talk. So, neurodivergent describes somebody with neurological functioning or cognitive processes that are in some way atypical. Neurotypical is the counterpart word describing somebody with typical neurological functioning. And neurodivergence is the state of being neurodivergent. I hope that all makes sense to everyone. Neurodivergent and neurotypical are adjectives in the same way that an object might be blue or heavy or spiky. A person can be neurodivergent or neurotypical. Neurodiversity describes the overall diversity of human minds, and diversity is very much the property of a group. An individual on their own can't be diverse. So I've tried to illustrate that with some silly little shapes. So if we look at this little blue triangle and go, okay, is it normal? Whatever that means. What about in this group? Still normal? And then what about this group at the bottom where it is suddenly the only blue triangle? So it's gone from being entirely normal in one context to just considered as not normal in another. And the point I want to make with that is that normal or typical is very much contingent on your environment. It's not a universal thing. I hope that all makes sense. So in this talk and in the projects that I've been involved with, we take a very broad view of what might be considered neurodivergent. These differences might be inherited, might be lifelong. So autism and ADHD would be quite good examples of these. There's thought to be genetic components. But neurodivergence might also develop later in life due to somebody's experiences or the environment that they're in. Equally, some differences might be noticed and recognized when somebody is very, very young. Others might not be noticed, might not be recognized until someone's much older. For that reason, I'm considering mental health conditions as part of the neurodivergent sort of community umbrella, because a lot of the experiences that are associated with mental health conditions and mental health challenges are not generally considered part of the normal experience. And it's important to note that while I've suggested that mental health conditions might be acquired, might be transient, not something that someone has their whole life, they can also be lifelong. Okay, good. That slide has worked. So I'm trying to give an overview here, give some examples, and the conditions that I talked about on the previous slide are examples of neurodivergence, but not everyone who has these experiences will necessarily self-identify as neurodivergent. In the same way, not everybody who has a physical or mental impairment with a substantial and long-term negative effect on their ability to do day-to-day activities will necessarily consider themselves disabled. The reason that's in quotes is because that is the definition in UK law. So I've taken that quote from the Equality Act. There are parallels with how language is used and how people self-identify in other marginalized groups. So this is not entirely unexpected. More context setting. I'm going to talk briefly about ways that we think about disability and neurodivergence generally. This will be relevant later. There's kind of three broad models. There's the medical model, the social model, and the social relational model. So the medical model generally considers disability or neurodivergence as an individual problem, as something wrong with that person that could be fixed or adjusted for or accommodated. And this also generally considers disability and neurodivergence as something that is fixed and doesn't really change. The social model considers disability as the result of somebody's environment, that it is the environment that is inaccessible and disables certain bodies or ways of thinking and working. And this model doesn't inherently treat disability or neurodiversity as fixed. The social relational model kind of sits in between. So it acknowledges that having a disability, being disabled, means there are some things that someone just can't do, but it also focuses on the structural barriers that make things much more difficult than they should be for that disabled person. So to kind of illustrate that with an example, the most magical, accessible, perfect environment in the world does not make someone with a visual impairment able to see. It's not going to fix their eyes, right? But the accessible environment for that person is not one that relies on them seeing things or being able to use their sight. A lot of accommodations, a lot of support for disabled and neurodivergent people tends to fall into the medical model. These tend to be changes made for one person on a case-by-case basis rather than a change to the environment or the culture of an institution. So how might being neurodivergent affect somebody day to day? Neurodivergence is often described as a spectrum. This doesn't really mean it's a line from mildly neurodivergent to severely neurodivergent. It's perhaps better thought of as more like a wheel that's split into different areas for challenges or skills in different aspects. So language, motor skills, organizing, planning, and so on. Again, I've tried to pick out some key concepts here. This isn't covering absolutely everything, but one of the biggest differences is differences in sensory processing. So this might show up as hypersensitivity to certain stimuli, where bright lights or sounds or smells might be overwhelming or might even be painful, or it might show up as hyposensitivity, where somebody really needs loud music or strong scents to self-regulate to help them concentrate. From teaching in a chemistry lab, the sensory processing differences is one of the big ones, and it's the one that tends to catch people out. So students who are very new to a lab environment often find the very bright overhead lighting, the strong smells you get in a chemistry lab, wearing the lab coats and all the protective equipment, and the constant noise of the fume hoods running. People find this incredibly disorienting and overwhelming, and I strongly suspect that this crosses over into research settings. Obviously, this is also going to affect people outside of the lab. So speaking for myself, I don't leave the house without headphones because I live in central London. It is loud all the time. But if I've always got headphones on me, I can make sure that there's always some kind of sound that I can predict, that I like, and most crucially, that I'm in control of. One of the other key differences and one of the key ways that neurodiversity might influence someone in day-to-day life is different ways of processing information. So some neurodivergent people will need really clear, detailed instructions that don't rely on any ability to infer or to read between the lines, while others will want the freedom to approach a task as they see fit with as little direction as possible. Some neurodivergent people might need a lot of help organizing their time and structuring their day. Other neurodivergent people might be really, really good at organizing themselves and others. Work preference for working in different formats might also be related to neurodiversity. So dyslexic people, for example, often find it easier to read documents that aren't black text on white background and prefer documents where the contrast is lower with a colored background on the document that they're looking at, or specific dyslexia-friendly fonts. This might be an area where it's easier to build in support, because if documents are distributed in editable formats, this lets individuals set the background color, the font, the style, in whatever way works for them, or they can use text-to-speech software to listen to the document rather than read it. Neurodivergence can also influence someone's preference for routine or predictability. So some neurodivergent people work best if there's novelty, if there's always something new, because that's how they self-regulate. It's how they can control what they're focusing on. Other neurodivergent people really need a specific structure and routine in their day. This might also mean that people vary in when they work best. Some people really need a shared office and to be around other people, not necessarily to have a conversation, but just to be around other people and be in an environment where everybody's working. Other people are going to need a private individual space away from everyone else to not get distracted. So what was my experience with all of this? So I suspected that I was autistic from 9 or 10 years old. I did not get a diagnosis until my mid-20s, and not very long before I started my PhD. it is likely that part of the reason I wasn't diagnosed was because I did quite well academically in the very highly structured environment of compulsory education. Probably part of the reason I wasn't diagnosed until much later was that every time there was a clear indicator I was autistic, the response was always, "Oh, you're just like your father," which perhaps did not help. I'd had various mental health challenges from quite young. I'm not, I don't mind saying that. I'm not particularly ashamed of it. But when I started my undergraduate degree, things got worse. At the time, I thought it was just stress-induced mental health problems, um, which was partly true, but it was also likely that this was linked to me being a then undiagnosed autistic person. And I wanted some kind of external confirmation for myself. That was my main reason for seeking out a diagnosis. It took a couple of years. I started the process in 2018 and didn't get diagnosed until 2021. Personally, for me, having a diagnosis has ended up not being particularly relevant day to day. Partly that's because I was diagnosed as autistic, and essentially in the UK, once you're diagnosed, you don't really get very much support. You might get a small amount of peer mentoring, but there's no medication or anything like that. So, having just discussed the point at which I started seeking a diagnosis, it's worth asking what the picture is like in UK higher education. So, the next couple of slides are going to be some context setting for the projects that I've been involved with and how these have developed in the last 5 years. So this data is from a couple of years ago. This is from the Office for National Statistics in 2022. But this gives us an indication of the structural inequalities that neurodivergent people are facing. So approximately 18% of individuals with a mental health condition and around 20% of autistic people have a degree of any kind as their highest qualification. The comparable figure for non-disabled people is 43%. So if you have a mental health condition, if you're neurodivergent, you are significantly less likely to have access to higher education or to get through higher education and get a degree. This aligns with other data from the same point in time that strongly suggests the disparities observed in higher education are part of a broader pattern of inequality and unequal outcomes rather than isolated issues at particular universities or colleges. It also strongly suggests that the barriers people are encountering are systemic rather than individual. Because if we look at the data on percentage of autistic adults in employment, it's about 22%. That figure has not really moved very much in the last 5 years, which is a rather depressing statistic, quite frankly, to have as an autistic adult entering the workplace. It's not great. So if we drill down from the national picture to one particular university and one particular faculty within that university, we can see that students reporting a non-learning based disability had the lowest rates of satisfaction with their course, similarly low rates of agreement with statements about marking criteria and helpful feedback. And the one that's saddest for me were least likely to feel part of the university community. Again, this is from 2021 and 2022. Very helpfully, the survey questions changed in the 2022-23 academic year, so I can't compare back directly, but the key themes remain quite consistent over time. The categories that are indicated here are based on data collection recommendations from the Higher Education Standards Agency in the UK, which somewhat arbitrarily assigns category 51 to learning disability and categories 53 through 58 and 96 to other disability, not learning, which is basically everything else. These statistics should be treated with some caution, as people with ADHD under these categories are considered as having specifically a learning disability. A lot of people with ADHD do not agree with this classification and will self-report under a different category. So treat these statistics with some caution, but consistently we can see that neurodivergent and disabled students are having a worse time. The projects that I was involved with, we wanted a more qualitative and more in-depth look at why this was happening in a way that's hard to capture with purely quantitative data. So we ran a mix of focus groups and one-to-one interviews with participants at a range of levels of study. Some of these findings, I think, will translate. Some may be higher education specific, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. So these were the three core themes from our qualitative research. I think there are, like I say, I think there are likely to be patterns that apply. So one of the biggest challenges that our participants described was navigating university structures and the significant additional workload of organizing support alongside teaching and research. I've borrowed the idea of a second shift from feminist theory, as having a disability can be a similarly full-time job where the work doesn't get compensated or supported. And if you're disabled, you're often dealing with additional demands because of your disability while having fewer resources available to meet those demands because you are disabled. It's a very horrible catch-22. Alongside this, participants also talked about self-advocacy, as this is part of the additional work they were often doing. And this was also part of a conversation about factors that could work in their favor and how this helped them in asking for what they need. Because if they knew the language, if they knew how to describe what they were experiencing, how to ask for what they need, who to ask within the university, it speaks more broadly to knowing how university systems work, and this often links back to students' privilege in various ways. Obviously, one of the key parts of higher education is feedback, and participants described how dialogue feedback that was conversation, could be really powerful. And also talked about how it was much easier to have this conversation if they knew the academic well, whereas if it was someone they didn't know or somebody with a reputation for being quite scary, it was much harder to do. And obviously, this is something that can affect anybody, but it is particularly relevant if you're neurodivergent and, for example, you experience severe anxiety when speaking to someone for the first time, or you get so stressed trying to do something differently that you may not be able to speak, or you know that you misread social cues about when you can and can't ask questions. All of this makes it a lot harder to seek out feedback. The other big concept that kept coming up was the power dynamics in these situations. Because if students are trying to get supports put in place, the people making the decision about what support they get are staff. And again, it's much easier to ask for what you need and talk about what you're finding difficult if it's someone you know well. And these supports also usually came with the difficulty of fitting into a medical model. So participants who had fluctuations in their conditions often found it significantly harder to get support. There's also an expectation that you can prove why you need support. It's not about what do you find difficult, it's do you have the right paperwork? And all of this keeps coming back to who are the systems designed for? And this is where the boundary between academia, education, and research gets a little blurry. So postgraduate research students are very much in education. They are students, but they are also developing independent researchers who might be working on their own individual project or might be working in a larger research group. And several of our postgraduate interview and focus group participants described trying to access accommodations and support only to find that very little was set up for research degrees. And certainly this was my experience. As I quipped to my supervisor, extra time for a 3-hour final viva is not the most useful thing in the world. So a lot of the support is set up on the assumption that the people accessing support are primarily undergraduate students doing primarily closed book exams. And I put a couple of quotes on the right-hand side of the slide. These are shared anonymously with permission, but I think these are illustrative of some of the challenges that our participants faced and the importance of people being aware of what neurodiversity is and how to support people. In terms of my experience, I didn't get a huge amount of support during undergraduate study. I had extra time in exams, but the more important thing with that was because I had extra time, I was taking the exam in a smaller room with fewer people. And that was the thing that was useful rather than the extra time itself. There was very little support for laboratory work, which I found incredibly stressful and overwhelming, or for presentations, which I am not ashamed to say I really did not like and still find quite difficult. Things like this tend to be the exception because I'm quite confident in my knowledge and I like talking about it to interested parties. On a somewhat related note, group work and group projects were the worst. I don't think I know anyone who liked group work assessments, but this was something I found particularly challenging because so much of it was based on social expectations that I didn't recognize or couldn't follow. And if I pointed out that someone hadn't done the thing they said they were going to do, I was seen as the one with the problem, which is not great. In terms of my PhD experience, I was very recently formally diagnosed when I started. So I talked about it with my supervisors very early on to say, I'm autistic. I find these things difficult. I'm going to need extra support with these things. What can we put in place? And did that kind of very blunt expectation setting early. And these clear and non-judgmental conversations in the first couple of weeks were really, really useful to discuss expectations. How much was I going to be on campus? How much teaching was I planning to do? How much could I write? How much could I produce? This kind of thing. I will say that while I'd done a bit of research, I knew that my supervisors had done other equality and inclusion work. Looking back, this was quite naive. If they'd reacted badly to this disclosure and to me trying to do this expectation setting, it would have been a really, really bad start to the PhD. So I'm going to suggest that people don't follow my example. I was very, very fortunate to have a supportive and receptive supervisory team. For me, throughout the PhD, these conversations about expectations were ongoing. So I felt able to ask for support with the things I found difficult. This is something I would highlight as a transferable bit of good practice. Having the honest and non-judgmental conversations about capacity and how much someone can realistically get done in a given time frame are important in any workplace setting for everyone who works there. But I think it's particularly important for neurodivergent people. Some of us work in different ways or need additional time to process or organize work. Some people work in bursts of very intensely focused activity rather than producing the same amount every day. Some of us are going to work best at different times or not in a shared office. And someone working differently shouldn't be a bad thing. As long as the work gets done to a good standard, it shouldn't matter. But it's very much on whoever the line manager or whoever the manager is. They're the person who needs to kind of set that. We're going to have an open and honest and non-judgmental conversation. It's not it's not easy for the person being managed to set that. I've also provided a couple of quotes on this slide. So Monique Bofa is an autism researcher, and they've had, from the quote, they've had quite a similar experience to mine, which again is not great. The next few slides are going to be a very brief overview of my perspective on some of the key issues and current topics in neurodivergence research. All of this comes with a bit of a disclaimer that I am a researcher who is neurodivergent, which is not the same thing as being a researcher of neurodivergence. Some people are both, and I've tried to focus on literature that takes a participatory approach, so working with neurodivergent people, or in some instances is neurodivergence research being done by neurodivergent people. This is the first sort of big thing that I want to highlight. Stigma against neurodivergent people is still pervasive. And while individuals might consider their neurodivergence as something neutral, it's as much a part of them as the color of their hair. We know that we are stigmatized. Autistic people particularly have been pathologized and dehumanized extensively in research literature and popular media. And I've provided a quote here with a reference at the bottom of the slide. Slides will be sent round afterwards if you want to go and read the paper. But it's making the point that both the behaviors and the label are stigmatized, which often leads to a situation where people can disclose and be judged on the label, or not disclose and be judged on the behavior. But either way, there's going to be consequences. Related to this, much of the literature around neurodiversity in education and in the workplace talks about the pressure for neurodivergent people to fit into a neurotypical norm as a result of this stigma. This might be described variously as masking or camouflaging. Essentially, it is putting on a performance, putting on an act and acting like you are neurotypical because of the significant stigma associated with being openly neurodivergent. This kind of camouflaging or masking is not good for one's health. Extreme exhaustion is very, very commonly described, particularly in the workplace where it's quite hard to take a break. You always have to be on. And this paper at the bottom is talking about neurodivergent graduate students in STEM graduate programs, highlighting that the additional stress related to this kind of overwork and masking contributes to significant mental health challenges alongside the neurodivergence itself. Ultimately, it can lead to neurodivergent burnout, which is incredibly difficult to recover from. Looking at the workplace, difficulties are unfortunately common. Neurodivergent people are often bullied for not fitting into a typical workplace culture. And again, for many neurodivergent people, their ability to stay in employment is felt to be intrinsically linked to their ability to mask in this way. So what can we do to build inclusive spaces? I'm going to give you some of my recommendations, and then we're going to open up for questions. So as the obvious starting point, how accessible is the work that you're doing or the things that you're making? So if you produce a written report, can someone change the font size, change the background color, change the contrast? Is it screen reader supported? If you're using audio, have you provided a transcript? And this is relevant to things other than neurodiversity as well. Somebody with visual impairment might appreciate that as much as someone who's autistic. The National Autistic Society in the UK, their website has a really good demonstration of this. There's accessibility options at the top of the website where you can put on screen masks, you can change the contrast, change the font size, have text read aloud to you, and so on. So if you want to explore what tools someone might be using, I'd recommend that as a resource. Then thinking who is in the room when you're having this conversation. So neurodivergent people can often be disadvantaged by traditional interview processes because of implicit expectations about being charismatic, maintaining eye contact, modulating your tone of voice, and so on, while also talking to someone new, talking up their strengths and talents, and strategically downplaying their weaknesses or things they find difficult. For me, I know there's also the question of how honest you're supposed to be in an interview. Because even if you're describing a situation that actually happened, you're expected to spin the description to focus on what you as the interviewee did. This is something I find really difficult. I want to be able to credit everybody involved because I haven't done any of the things that I've done entirely on my own, and probably neither has anyone else. But that's not how you're meant to talk about it in an interview. Following on from that, once someone is in the room, what does that room look like? How busy is it? How loud? So if you're a manager, it's important to have a conversation with your team about what they find challenging about where they work, and crucially, what they think would make things easier. So different people might need different things. Neurodivergent people might already have their own solutions for everyday difficulties, and this needs to be an ongoing conversation. So all the projects that I've worked on have been driven by co-construction with neurodivergent students and staff, and our lived experience has been a huge part of that work. So I'm going to cross over with the day job and the PhD research a little bit here. One of the things that I discussed in my thesis as an approach to improving students' understanding is to co-create criteria, to build it up together, because this means you develop a shared understanding of what those criteria mean and look like in practice. It's also really important to build in space to practice new skills, and that's true whether you're a student learning a new thing in the lab or whether you're taking on a new aspect of a project in a research setting. Similarly, for anything involving group work, whether that's lab groups, research groups, extended projects, or anything else, it's really important that everyone's on the same page about team expectations, both for accountability, have people done what they've said they're going to do, but also for knowing how other people communicate and work. It also helps to build empathy for those different approaches. One of the things that our research participants talked about was the huge amount of additional work associated with group projects because they didn't want to have to tell people that they were neurodivergent or ask for adjustments or support, and the huge amount of stress that this created. Fundamentally, in a university setting, the issue is that often teaching assessment is designed for the majority, and anyone who doesn't or can't fit is othered. Disabilities might be accommodated in some circumstances, but if you look at most equalities legislation in the UK, you'll find that accommodations are prevalently mandated in legislation. Students' right to inclusive and accessible teaching and assessment is not. So the question I'm going to pose to you is, how could your research setting, your labs, your workplaces be designed to be inclusive from the start rather than making disabled and neurodivergent people make their own adjustments after the fact for a workplace that wasn't designed with them in mind? So that brings us to the end. There's a couple of QR codes and some links on the slide if you would like to read some of the case studies, some of the things that we've written. I was going to say there's contact details for me on the slide, and I completely forgot to put them on. I'm so sorry. I think I've run slightly over time. Apologies, I've not actually given this presentation before, so this was a little stressful. But thank you everyone for listening, and let's get into the Q&A. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think, Zavara, you were going to stop the recording?